So watch what you say. So thank you all for joining us to continue our anti-racism discussions. Skip Sanders and I welcome you, and we truly appreciate you. Now let's mute ourselves as Father Ray leads us in prayer.
And indeed, let us all pray. You who bring together, you who bind with the bond of love, we gather tonight, seeking to strengthen this binding, which reflects your common love for all people, for all creation. Give us breadth of vision and discernment as we discuss issues that have been so divisive. Let us ask questions we've not asked. Let us ponder ideas we've not pondered. Let us see things we've not seen before, simply because we choose now to see through the eyes of Jesus, with the clarity of the gospel. Let us leave our time together grateful for your presence and committed to the creative work you continue among us and within us, now and forever, to which we all say,
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Father, for that beautiful prayer.
you're welcome.
Thank you so much. And good evening, church family. So great always to be together with you. I go to my introduction of Ray Vardy. We began the practice in our past meetings of using just a few minutes to learn about African Americans who have played a significant role in American history. Maryland's rich legacy in this regard made this brief overview particularly appropriate for us. Our recent meetings have been so full of content that Peggy and I felt we were not giving appropriate attention to the work of those of you who volunteered to highlight someone's life for the rest of us. So to remedy that, we're devoting up to 5 minutes at the top of our meeting to this summary. Tonight, we're fortunate to have Ray Barr share some facts about a Marylander who undoubtedly would be one of the country's 5 best known historical Black persons. Ray has been deeply involved in some research to deepen our knowledge about this Marylander's story. And so Ray, the next 5 minutes are yours.
You're muted. You're muted, Ray.
Where is he?
Can you unmute?
Okay.
There you
Yes, you got 5 minutes, Ray.
Yes.
It's great to see every one of you.
What are you?
Fred Jenkins was a tremendous, remarkable person in the 19th century, probably the best known abolitionist. He started here in Fells Point with getting educated, and he felt that education was important in order to get freedom, in order to get out from under oppression. So I won't go into the long aspects about education, and he felt that reading was most important, reading in order to get his freedom. So when he was able to break away and escape Fells Point and to go north, he went to Bedford, Massachusetts as a slave. And you know, there was a freedom, there was a slave law at the time that if a slave was found in another state, they had to be returned, and he would have been a plantation slave, which more brutality, and then in contrast to an urban slave that would work in, say, the building industry and like building boats. So he developed himself as an orator in the Massachusetts area and became very famous. In fact, he started writing books early, and he wrote his first bibliography when he was 27 years of age, and it reached 1 million people and made him somewhat known around the world. And because he was still a slave, he went to Europe and was treated royally over there. And people over there paid money to free him. So he came back and was free. And he started becoming a tremendous lecturer, abolitionist throughout. And his most famous speech was when he was 34 years of age. He was asked to give a speech at Independence Day, and he wrote his speech, very famous. "What to the slave is your 4th of July?" And it sort of shook us all up, Americans at the time, because they felt that because of the preamble to the Constitution, that everybody was the same, all free. And it made known that no, the blacks were not free, and they wouldn't be free until the Emancipation was signed in 1863. So that was a major speech that he gave at that time, and became well known continuously after that. When he was about 43, Lincoln got to know him, and Lincoln gave a very famous speech in Cooper Institute in New York. I don't know if you know about the Cooper Institute, but Peter Cooper was a person who founded the Canton Company in Baltimore, and went with his money, went back to New York and started the Cooper Institute in Lower Manhattan. And they had a large debate hall, and he wanted that in order to have great people debate issues, democratic issues. And one of the first persons to give a speech was Abe Lincoln in 1860. And that was the speech that made the people think made him president of the United States. It was called Might to Right speech. And Fred Douglass liked this very much, and he followed up with this with a lecture that he gave, Men of Color to Arms, at about the time that the Civil War was starting. And Lincoln wanted to free the slaves, but he also wanted to save the nation. So that started a relationship between Frederick Douglass and Lincoln that went on until Lincoln's death. But they interacted a lot, and it was not necessarily a smooth interaction, because I think Frederick Douglass never trusted fully Lincoln, because his motive was to save the nation first and to free the slaves second. And it wasn't until they put together the Emancipation Proclamation that would free the slaves. And why that was important, because it'd be difficult to get a law passed in a short period of time, but by signing a piece of paper, you could free all the slaves in the South. And that was important because we had just lost 12,000 soldiers in Antietam, and the war was starting to turn towards the Confederates, and Lincoln needed some troops. So by signing that Emancipation Declaration and working with Frederick Douglass, he was able to get 200,000 black soldiers into the Massachusetts Army, and from thereafter the war changed, and the Union was able to win over the Confederate. So that relationship stayed, and that went on to the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, and that was abolishing slavery. Frederick Douglass also worked with Lincoln concerning Amendments 14th and 15th, but those were passed long after Lincoln had died. But they maintained that relationship between the two. And when Lincoln won his second term and had his inaugural speech, it was very important for him that Frederick Douglass become part of that. And he made sure that he came to the inaugural ball because, and I'll read to you what he said. As Douglass approached the crowd, Lincoln called out, "Here comes my friend Douglass." The president took Douglass by the hand. "I'm glad to see you. I saw you in the crowd today. How did you like it?" What Lincoln wanted to know was, how was my speech? Because Frederick Douglass was such a great speechwriter that he appreciated that, and he wanted to know, how was mine? And and because of that relationship, of a little bit of mistrust, they never answered themselves completely. And Douglas hesitated. Mr. Lincoln, I must not detain you with my poor opinion when there are thousands waiting to shake your hand. No, no, the president said, you must stop a little, Douglas. There's no man whose opinion I value more than yours. I want you to know what you think. And Douglas replied, I'm glad you liked it. And with that, Douglas went on making waves, and he said, I thought your speech was a sacred effort. So in other words, it was okay, but in a certain way. It was not the complete sort. It was a great speech or something like that. And that was the relationship. And let me read you something else, which is very shows what the relationship between the two. We are different men, races. We have between us a broader difference than exists between almost any other two races. Even when you choose to be slaves, you're not yet removed from being placed on equality with the white man. So out of that came the feeling with Black people that you never really become a 10, maybe an 8 or 9, but you never really get to be a 10. And that you got to struggle in order to get that. So that was part of his teaching of young African Americans. Struggle was the most important aspect, and that in order uh, to uh, and they asked him what he wanted on his tombstone, and he said, agitate, agitate, agitate. The important being that you never are as good as, but you have to, the struggle goes on, and you have to agitate and agitate in order to get true justice, equal justice under the law. And
That's a beautiful place. Thank you, Ray. That was great. I thought you were going to tell us about something else maybe we'll mention at the end of the meeting, all that work you've done in Canton. So if we have time, we'll get back to that because you've done a great job.
Not gonna take another one.
Legacy.
Been too
At any
long.
rate, thank you for giving us a great start on
Could I
this.
ask for a,
Someone? Did someone want to talk?
Chuck, unmute.
You need to unmute.
Chuck, you're muted.
There.
There you go.
All right, unmute,
There,
okay.
wanted to say
can you
something.
hear me now?
Yes.
Yes,
I thought I was unmuted. I just wanted a minute at the end of the meeting about Douglas too, about, more local history about him and things that we've done for him in Maryland, in the
great.
city and so forth.
Great.
Yeah, I think you're going to get into what Ray, and you've been involved in with the Canton project. That'll be great. Let's try to
And
do
at
that. Peggy.
President Street Station.
Yes, we'll definitely, let's try to get to that at the end. Peggy and I've commented frequently over the past 2 weeks on how spirit inspired the November session with Justin and Jill has turned out to be. Sadly, everything he alerted us to, we saw come to some sort of fruition. The sickening Camp Auschwitz tees with staff printed on the back of them alluded even to the potential international linkages that he mentioned. So I don't know if some of you really felt this sort of sense of, oh my Lord, we had talked about this in November. At our first meeting in September, John and several others mentioned that the goal of our time together should be an agreed upon project that would have impact against racism at the structural or systemic level. Tonight, we begin to look toward that goal as we begin the first of 3 sessions on reparations. What does the term mean? What is its history? What have been the outcomes of past reparations initiatives? A review of the subject cannot be done justice in just 1 session. The subject's so important that we are going to give the information the time it deserves. And Peggy has done a yeoman's amount of work in her research on this. The subject is also something that came up and was touched upon by Audrey Rogers in her magnificent reflection on the excerpt from Matthew's Gospel on Epiphany Sunday. If you recall, Audrey applied Viktor Frankl's words to the Germans to our own situation. And she said his words were, "We may not be guilty of enslavement, but we are liable for its aftermath." In so doing, she also heeded Jerry Fiakowski's recommendation that we begin as a group using more often the first person pronoun, singular and plural, in our deliberations, turning our deliberations toward ourselves. Audrey also used briefly a set of lenses that, whether or not we use them, they put the emphasis on the difficulty of people of color to move forward in our society. In the urban setting especially, the barriers have been in alphabetical order: access to education, access to health, access to housing, access to food, access to job advancement opportunities, access to political representation and voice, access to transportation. These lenses put the emphasis where it really belongs, not on people's pace of movement forward, but on the obstacles deliberately barring their way to move. With that, we are ready to begin, Peggy.
Thank you, Skip. First, a huge thank you to Jack Schmidt for a book I borrowed from him to help with my research. Reparation, and specifically, we're talking about reparation for Blacks. What is it? It's basically a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for the grievous injustice that began with slavery. After seeing the horror of the siege on the Capitol 2 weeks ago and the Confederate flag carried through the halls, we know we have much to do. It is not enough to think Blacks deserve it because of slavery. We need to be knowledgeable about what happened after slavery. There have been numerous opportunities since the end of the Civil War to change the course of racism and oppression. There have been a few apologies and monetary payouts, but nothing in the magnitude deserved. So what is one thing that you learned from the Ta-Nehisi Coates article that really moved you?
Is there any particular part? He really gave a face to the whole issue of reparations through the families he covered, Rosses and so forth. Did anything in particular hit you? How did he put that kind of lens concept together that Audrey talked about in terms of education or housing or land or any of those things? Was there anything that really kind of impressed you or touched you with that?
For me, it was kind of going back to what you said a few moments ago, Skip,
Mhm.
and that is that watching what happens to a given individual or a given family over a period of time, that it is so easy to talk in generalities about groups, but when you read over and over again about concrete individual human beings doing what they do, um, it brings another dimension to it. We're not talking about ideas and principles. We're talking about living, breathing human beings, and that's the thing that hit me most powerfully from it.
Someone
Skip,
else?
Skip.
Yes, John.
One of the things that's in the Coates article, and I'm sorry I didn't review it before coming to this meeting, is that there's a real history of reparation payments, both in the United States and in Western Europe, that I was totally unaware of, for injuries in most cases much less severe than what the African American slaves in our country have experienced. So this is not new. This is just a moral decision that people who preceded us decided to do, to try to close the door and say to these marginalized people that they deserve better than what they've been given. So if anybody doesn't know that story, they may want to go back and look at the laundry list of reparation payments, because I didn't know anything about it. And that really surprised me. One of the reparation payments was to Southern slave owners for their loss of slave services. But I believe it was the federal government that made that payment. And that's quite interesting if you're in a discussion with people about reparations.
We'll cover some of those too, John. Thank you.
And John, I think you'll get to see how every attempt gets thwarted for one reason or another, or has been, which was so fascinating. For those of us who are in our senior years, lived through some of the events in Baltimore, did anything sound familiar in terms of either education or housing or land? For me, it was remembering my parents moving from Madison Avenue, where the line was drawn at Fulton Avenue in terms of Black and white residents. They had been moved first to McCullough Street, one side, and the other McCullough, then to Fulton, and then finally out to Walbrook Junction. And then how all the block busting and everything just broke open that whole West Baltimore area. And at one point, there was one realtor in particular who was one of very few people who would sell to Blacks. His name was Morris Goldsecker. And as I was a kid, I'd be walking down Papa Grove Street to St. Edward's Church, and you just see signs popping up. Another home sold by Morris Goldsecker, another home sold by. And the interesting thing was he knew how to collect the mortgage, because the whole thing was to scare white people into selling low, because in the neighborhood, if they saw one or two Black residents, they panicked and sold. Then he would buy low from them and then sell high to the incoming Black family. And he would come around every 2 weeks and collect the mortgage. I don't know where my father's mortgage came from, but he knew that he needed to collect every 2 weeks, or else they stood a good chance of going into arrears because of all the disparities, and the difference in interest rates and all. Anyone else have any memories like that?
Yeah, I do, Skip.
Yeah.
My parents lived in Northwood. And, the block busting started in Northwood. And my parents were told that if they didn't sell now, they would never get any value out of their house. And of course, they sold too. But I don't think that anyone knew at that time that not only were the people who had been scared now and were selling, were getting the raw end of the deal, but the people coming in were getting it too. So people like Morris Goldsecker was getting it coming and going, and that was across the US.
Mhm.
And it's awful.
Just a little note on following up on good old Morris. Edmondson Village, of course, has a very famous story. That is written up in a book.
Yeah.
What happened to Edmondson Village.
Mm.
And I know Mary Larkitis was a part of that whole evolutionary thing like I was. And I think I mentioned this to this group once before, but the racial disparity or fear, our pastor, Louis Vaith, got up and said to all of us, and I remember this very clearly, they will never cross that bridge.
Mhm.
Okay, that bridge was the Hilton Street Bridge.
Yes.
Okay. And Goldsecker made sure that he was wrong. And it started on the south side, okay, of Edmondson Avenue, and then crept over to the north side of Edmondson Avenue.
It was a
So-
terrible time. It was a
It
really
was.
terrible time.
It really was. And there are stories about people from St. Bernardine's in that book,
Mhm.
okay, who tell you what they did to some of the Black people who moved in, to their neighborhoods in terms of harassment. But
So I'm going to ask you to kind of keep these personal anecdotes in mind as we listen to what Peggy's going to present, because that means many of us have lived a part of the story. And as she goes through the history from the beginning, I think you're going to feel it even more deeply. And we'll break from her presentation from time to time just to see if it's triggered a memory or something you want to say. But there's a lot that she has to share. Peggy?
Thanks, Skip. Sorry, not very good at my transitions. The subject of reparations has a long history, as long as efforts to abolish slavery. In 1846, Gerrit Smith supported John Brown's efforts for anti-slavery insurrection in Virginia and donated 120,000 acres, 40-acre lots for 3,000 free Blacks in upstate New York. Unfortunately, Northern Black settlers had no experience in farming, and it ended in 1855. In 1861, President Lincoln introduced a government reparations plan, the Port Royal experiment. South Carolina had 57% Blacks and 195 abandoned cotton plantations. Former slaves worked the plantations and received salaries. The government agreed to buy the cotton, but few received payment. It was too costly to save the plantations that were destroyed during the war and by subsequent white attacks. President Lincoln, on January 1st, 1863, in the Emancipation Proclamation, directed the Confederacy to surrender, or owners would not receive compensation for freeing their slaves, and it allowed suitable former slaves into the U.S. Armed Forces that Ray was talking about. In February, the Republican Party proposed that every Black Union soldier get 10 acres, but it didn't pass. Some Union soldiers forced Black men by any means to fight. Lincoln's plan of reparations was not working. Blacks were continually barred from getting an education. Mobs occasionally burned down schools and flogged teachers who attempted teaching Blacks.
Peggy, I just wanted to throw one addition in because it was raised about, as Ray said, about the Emancipation Proclamation. In 1862, actually, Lincoln issued an order to the generals about the Emancipation Proclamation in January, letting them know that what he was offering the South was the chance to keep its slaves if it did not secede from the Union. Right. So it was a tool, really, emancipation was a tool to try to hold the South to the North, because you could keep your slaves if you didn't secede. Or you also had the option to set a date of postponement for emancipation. So those really, it was a very pragmatic thing he did. And as Ray said, he was kind of conflicted. So the picture is he didn't necessarily believe people should be enslaved, but that didn't mean he thought that Blacks were not inferior.
Right. Thanks.
And he did support their being sent back to Africa.
Yeah.
Thank you. And in 1864, the Republican-led Congress passed the Wade-Davis bill, requiring before readmittance to the Union that 50% of white voters in a state take an oath to the Union and give Black men the right to vote. But President Lincoln didn't sign it. He advocated for a milder plan. He thought 50% of the white males was too high. In March 1865, a Freedmen's Bureau bill was approved, but its provision for land to former slaves was not forcefully implemented, and a subsequent bill was vetoed. Land packages were available, but they were too expensive for Black men.
Okay.
Oops, sorry.
Nope, is that a pause point or are you going to go on?
Yeah, no, I'm trying to pull up my notes again. Sorry. 6
Okay.
days after the Civil War ended, Booth assassinated Lincoln on 4/15/1865. 3 days before that, Lincoln talked about giving free Black men who served in the Union military and literate Southern Black men voting rights. John Wilkes Booth said, "That means nigger citizenship." That is the last speech he'll ever make. Benjamin Franklin in 1790 had petitioned the first Congress to outlaw slavery, but it had failed. Slavery was the price the North paid to keep the Southern elite in the Union. The Confederacy was established and states seceded, believing the Negro inferior to whites and needed for the menial tasks for whites. White supremacy found its absolute expression in the words of Confederate General Robert E. Lee, who said that slavery was a moral and political evil, but justified and necessary, that whites generously performed a difficult service for Blacks by enslaving them, believing Blacks were better off than in Africa, morally, socially, and physically. Painful discipline was necessary for their instruction as a race to lead to better things. He thought their emancipation would come from mild influence of Christianity and not controversy. So we know we failed. We have all read about the atrocities committed against Black people before the Civil War, and one would expect them when the war ended, so would the oppression. But the mindset was not changed for many. Andrew Johnson became president after Lincoln, and he hated Blacks more than he hated elite Southerners. So there would be no Black inclusion in American policy in shaping the Reconstruction. The Union failed to produce Black citizenship or punish the rebels. He left Black voting up to the states, and that was a huge mistake. He made no provisions for Blacks. He said it was a country for white men, and while he was president, it would be a government for white men. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery in 1865, but it was immediately followed by the Jim Crow legislation. In 1867, during the Radical Reconstruction, the 14th Amendment granted equal protection to former slaves, and the 15th Amendment, the right to vote, in 1870. But the savagery of white supremacists escalated. Ulysses S. Grant, the next president, sent troops against the KKK and others the Democratic Party used to intimidate and burn and murder, to shut down the Black vote. White terrorists killed 53,000 Blacks after the war, and Reconstruction was overthrown. The radical Republicans were committed to Black rights, but they weren't unified. Even though Black individuals influenced public policy with public funding for schools and a fairer system of voting, white supremacists mounted a terror campaign to shut down any progress. Groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, proponents of the Lost Cause, reduced it to Black misrule and corruption, and they buried the progress. And they painted the Confederates as the heroes. Individual states could have made the decision to end slavery, but whites controlled the voting. The 15th Amendment allowed states to establish voting criteria, like a literacy test, but 80% of the Black males hadn't been taught to read or write. In Virginia, only white men with 100 acres of land or 25 acres and a house could vote. Some places charged a fee for the right to vote. They called it a poll tax. Voter intimidation and rolling back voter rights continue today. So what kinds of suppressions did you witness during this last election?
And what kinds of things are still being practiced, particularly in southern states that suppress voting?
And don't forget to unmute if you'd like to make a comment.
Thanks. Ray, is that your hand up? Oh, I saw a hand on you.
One thing that they would do is put one voting box per county, which allowed persons who lived in smaller counties with 85 people in it even could all easily get to the voting box. But if you lived in a big city with hundreds of thousands of people, you could not get to, you had to get to that again, just one box.
And so that brings to mind that whole transportation access question that we looked at a little bit earlier. What about qualifications for voting? Anybody remember anything that's being done down?
I think Danny had a comment. Danny?
Yeah, I recall in the last state elections leading up to the primary, it was a primary election.
Mhm.
Kentucky, this was Mitch McConnell's state.
Mhm.
They used the coronavirus, the government used the coronavirus as an effective tool to remove polling areas in the, I think it was like 600,000, maybe 800,000, 600,000 black area.
Wow.
And one poll available to those 600,000 voters.
Unbelievable.
I don't know how, obviously, Amy McGrath still made it a close race, but I don't know how effective it was in terms of getting transportation to those people. But if they would have had reasonable voting polls in that 600,000 area, I don't think Mitch McConnell would be in the Senate, without a doubt.
Well, another thing that is just this past month is in Georgia, the only reason that they had the runoff elections was because of a state law that required a majority in order to be elected during the November election. And the only reason they have that law was to prevent blacks from voting in a block and electing someone.
What about qualifications, the driver's license thing, everybody?
Oh, yeah, identification.
Yes. And so if you don't have an automobile,
Your signature.
right, you may not have a driver's license, but then you can vote. Mary Catherine, did you have your hand up?
That's what I was going to say. They changed a lot of the rules. So you had to have identification, or some of the states had, if you hadn't voted in a year or two, then you were dumped off the polls, and all kinds of changes in the way things were that you could vote. And also I hear that the lines for where the blacks were voting, the way they had less voting machines or whatever it was, that it took them hours to vote, where it wasn't true in the white neighborhoods. I mean, they just did numerous things to make it very difficult for them.
And they can do that so easily and make it sound, oh, so equitable. We're giving each county 40 voting machines. And again, one county has 150 people in it, and another county has 150,000 people in it.
Right. Maureen, did you have something?
Yeah, well, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was supposed to address a lot of these things. And up until the Trump administration, and I don't recall exactly the name of the law, but you used to have to explain and justify in the places that had changes in voting rules and so on. You had to make those, and those states which had a history of voter suppression, they had to make a defense to the federal government was required that their policies were not discriminatory. And that requirement was eliminated in the last administration.
That was
So
done
it
by the
had been-
Supreme Court.
Yeah, and it had been in place, more than 50 years. And they're saying, oh, well, heck, we don't need that anymore. Well, but as we have been seeing, there are many ways to suppress the vote. And one of the things we have argued against, of course, is photo ID. And you should not be asked for any ID so that is discriminatory, because not everyone has a current photo ID. There are good reasons that you might not have one. That's just a tiny thing, but also closing polling places, making it difficult, making them remote locations with and limiting the hours and not appropriately staffing them, all kinds of things that make it really difficult to vote. I mean, you want to do your duty, but not if it's going to be more than 2 hours. I don't know, it's a lot to ask of people to stand and so on.
And wasn't there a place that there were people armed outside the polling place? Where was that? Does anybody remember? Intimidation.
I don't remember the specific place, but there was intimidation. People who were carrying rifles saying they were just protecting the safety.
Right.
And so forth, but they were really intimidating people of color.
Absolutely.
I know this wasn't the last election, but in 2000, according to Ta-Nehisi Coates in Florida, it totally cost the election. I mean, this time it didn't cost it, but in 2000, Gore, apparently in Florida, he said there were over, I think, 130,000 Black votes that were suppressed for multiple reasons, registrations and things thrown out. And as you remember, Gore only lost in Florida by like 1,700 or something like that, and it went to the Supreme Court. And according to him, it was that was the cause.
Yeah, we have a lot of work to do, no doubt about it. So the Freedmen's Bureau was a government relief agency. It was to help former slaves with food, clothing, fuel, and 40-acre land grants. But white Southerners prevented it. White paramilitary groups organized against freedmen and Republicans, destroying property and killing, and they fashioned the post-war South just like the pre-war. Apprentice laws allowed children to be sold or forced to work without pay. The federal government said Black labor could not be free, but employers forced Black employees to toil at the owner's will with low wages. Grant signed the Enforcement Act of 1871, making it criminal to conspire to overthrow the US government, which drove white supremacist groups underground. But then the Democrats took the US House and Grant washed his hands of the radical Republicans. Federal troops were withdrawn from Florida and Louisiana and South Carolina as a condition of Hayes being elected, so Blacks and the Republicans were abandoned. The Supreme Court eroded and reversed legal measures allowing Blacks' rights, giving the KKK full reign of intimidation, and the South became the Democratic Party. In 1890, Mississippi adopted a new constitution denying Black men the vote. The newspaper had, "Political domination of the white race was threatened by the education of the Negro." So the governor closed the Black public schools. Jim Crow laws were state and local statutes legalizing racial segregation. Throughout the 1900s, there were white assaults on Black communities in Arkansas, Illinois, DC, Texas, South Carolina, Virginia, Nebraska, Indiana, Arizona, and in 1920 in Ocoee, Florida, a massacre killed 50 Blacks trying to vote. And in 1921, the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre razed the Black Wall Street. Military planes dropped incendiary devices on Black homes and businesses. White soldiers killed Black soldiers on military bases. There were about 4,000 lynchings from 1877 to 1950. That was during our lives, at least most of us. We discussed in previous months the percentage of Black people murdered by police, redlining, contract buying. Take a moment and think about examples that you have seen or that you know about that impose segregation. For example, Black neighborhoods were demolished to make way for federal highways. And in 1972, a federal highway official said it was a good opportunity to get rid of local nigger towns. Segregation took many forms. So what are some others that you could think of?
What about locally? Anybody reminded of what happened here during that period of time in terms of
This is a little bit
placement?
different, although it includes it. My best friend at the time was Jewish and moved into a house in Timonium, and he had read the community covenant, and Jews and Blacks were not allowed to move into housing due to the covenant of the community, and that would have been in the 70s. Oh no, yeah, in the 70s. And I was I could, so he hid his, and for most of the time I knew him, he hid his religious identity. So it was for an Iowa boy, it was kind of a wake up call. I just couldn't believe that a community association could have a covenant that dictated who could and who could not move into a particular area.
Roland Park was a covenant community, and the same criteria, Father Ray, no Blacks or Jews.
Yep.
An interesting thing is when Pam and I bought our first home, we bought it in Lockern, right up Liberty Road, just before the Beltway. And part of the paper they gave us, they said, of course, this no longer is legally binding, but part of what we have was the covenant that said that, no home in Lockern would be sold to Blacks. So that was among the papers that we had. So there were covenant communities. Anybody know about the Jones Falls Expressway and its construction?
I was going to talk about I-70.
Okay.
Interstate I-70 that was supposed to go through Leakin Park, and then went right down between Mulberry and Franklin Street. Okay, just totally blocked off that entire community. Okay, that may have been across those two streets. And then the reverse happened when Hogan, they were going to run the metro down there, and he killed the metro, which of course would have added a feeder for people living in the neighborhood. So there was a double whammy that happened on that particular area. The red line was supposed to run down there, and Hogan killed it.
And it really was a very extreme thing, because the red line, Al, would have connected
Social Security.
Right, Social Security and all of that western suburb all the way east, so that people without transportation could go where the jobs were. That was the whole thing.
Yeah.
And I'm told that the same sort of consideration was given to part of the construction of 83. If you've ever wondered why it meanders here, it was cutting through Black neighborhoods as, not being of any real worth to think about as it was chopping its way north to the Beltway.
Kathy,
Mary Catherine,
Mary
you just
Catherine.
have to unmute.
follow up with you, Skip, on the red line. When Hogan came in, the funds were already there for that line to be constructed. There was no needing to go into government and to try and negotiate or try to get the funds. The funds were there, state and federal, and he nixed it.
Yeah. Mary Catherine?
Not only
In the late 60s.
not only roads, but it's also pollution. You know, like that terrible polluting, burning trash in the poor neighborhoods downtown, but they build always the trash dumps and the polluting things, and the poor people can't move away because they don't have the money to move away. And they don't care because they think they don't have a voice, but they're killing the children with asthma and health problems with all these polluting industries that are dumped in Black neighborhoods. They had a whole environmental film about it the other day, about how these people are dying from cancer or just suffering from asthma, but it's terrible and it's racist.
Someone else.
In the late 60s, the East-West Expressway was supposed to go right through Black communities. It ended up destroying quite a few of them, plus Canton. And it was supposed to go right through the Catholic Center. So we were having meetings with people. We started Paul Sarbanes' career, and Barbara Mikulski was very active, and people like that. Art Cohen. Then we fought the road, and finally we did stop it, but it destroyed. And one of the great things they said they were going to do was they were going to build a public school for the community right over the road, not even thinking about the pollution coming, you know, for the cars, for all the children and all.
Yes, and that part that was built on the west side became known as the Expressway to Nowhere, because it just dumped you.
That's right.
At least because people were saying what a crime it would be to really run that thing through Leakin Park, that open land on the west side. But as Al said, the division between the neighborhood, it's just like taking a surgical knife and just splitting it. And I used to come to work that way often. You would see people literally running across that highway just to get really what was to the other side of the street, if you know, to be honest about it, taking their lives in their hands. And it was just a normal sight to see, especially young people just running across the highway to get to, because you'd have to go maybe 5 or 6 blocks before any street crossed over it, that a bridge was built over it.
You know, we're focusing on the city, and we talk about city neighbors. I didn't grow up here, so I wasn't here in those eras, but Jim Casey and I have talked about Long Island, where we grew up, and the greatest government subsidized, segregated, gated community without actually deed restrictions is the whole suburban development in every large city in the United States, subsidized by government infrastructure, by home mortgage interest deduction, supported by redlining, and directly supported by the Veterans Administration. So there, in the little subdivision I moved from Brooklyn to Long Island, there were 60 families. There were no Black families. Almost everybody was a GI and was using the GI Bill. We didn't know, and I'm sure our fathers didn't know, that Black GIs could not buy they didn't have to not buy, they didn't have to be a prohibition, they couldn't get a mortgage. And then bringing it home to our own side, you know, I went to Catholic high school on Long Island. There were no Black students in the 1,200 member student body of Chaminade High School, and the Catholic High School Association had its own athletic association. I remember seeing 2 Black athletes among what must have been, you know, 60 Catholic schools from the New York metropolitan area, largely suburban. And it wasn't that there were no Black Catholics. So we had our own methods of staying lily white that should come back to this issue of reparations.
When I worked in South Baltimore, Hanover Street to the west was where the Blacks lived. whites on the other side. Not only that, Locust Point, which was a pretty old community, they did not allow blacks to live there at all. And one family tried to move in, or did move in, and they burnt the house down. The neighbors or somebody did. So it was just very strong racism. That's all there was to it.
What year was that, Mary Catherine? Do you know?
I don't know when they burnt the house down. I wasn't working there, but I heard about that. But the big dividing line for Hanover Street was basically the whole time I lived there. And it moved to Charles Street on the edge. They were black people, but you did not see them in the other part of South Baltimore. It was white.
Sue Rovnick.
Hi.
You unmuted, so I suppose you want to speak, but we'd love to see your face, you know?
Yeah, well, hello. So I live in Edna Gardens, and I'm not originally from Baltimore. I grew up in a suburb of Pittsburgh, but I live in Edna Gardens, and I know that in 1929, when it was also a covenant community where blacks and Jewish were not allowed to buy. But I recently saw someone post an article on Nextdoor about the history of Northwood Shopping Center and how Morgan students helped to desegregate the shopping center, which is actually being torn down right now. But it also talked a lot about the Northeast neighborhoods and how kind of that fear of blacks, I guess, the fear of blacks buying and purchasing, like in Lauraville and in Northwood and that area up Hartford Road and such. So it's an interesting article. I'll go back and try to find it. I will pass it on if anybody's interested.
Yeah, Sue, that would be great. And I'm not sure I have your email address. If you would, if you want to put your email address in the chat, I can email you and make sure also that you get the links for things.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Everybody wants to go listen to the celebrations and the speeches tonight.
But
I wanted to talk. I have the book that Al mentioned. I do believe it was this one, Al. It's called Blockbusting in Baltimore, the Edmondson Village Story, which is where Al and I lived. And
yeah, I was interviewed for that book too. I'm the author. But
anyway, I have it if anybody wants to borrow it.
And they had a grand opening at the library when it got published. The Edmondson Village Library.
Great.
You know, I just want to say how much this means to me, because I think I was listening to Joe McNeely, thinking that I grew up in some kind of a lily white world, almost clueless myself about this stuff until the 60s when I was a young woman in college. But I mean, I think I just didn't think about it. And I grew up in Baltimore, and I grew up in Brooklyn, just a little bit south of Cherry Hill over the Hanover Street Bridge. And I grew up actually on Patapsco Avenue in Brooklyn, and that behind us, where my dad's garage was, were two black families that lived in two little houses back there. And we called them Uncle Sam and Aunt Alvy and Aunt Idie. And I don't think I thought much that these two families lived behind us. And we used to go in there on the hot summer days, and she would want to make us iced tea, but I wouldn't drink out of a glass because one time I saw her false teeth in a glass. And I thought I was going to get
that would do
in
it.
that glass. But that kind of thing, I mean, I think how I'm just listening to all this and what we've been reading and thinking I was like such a clueless white person, and I'm embarrassed about it. But one day I was playing hopscotch with two friends of mine from St. Rose. And that afternoon, the woman that lived in front of where we drew the hopscotch knocked on the door and said to my mother, "Are you aware that Jerry is playing with niggers?" And my mother said, "Excuse me?" And she said, "Are you aware?" And my mother said, "First of all, those girls are not Black. They're Italian. And secondly, it would be none of your business who Jerry plays with. And don't ever come to me and talk about someone like that again." And my mother never even finished high school. She grew up in Pigtown in an Irish Catholic family. And they were very poor as children. And she just didn't have any sense of that kind of discrimination. And I think I just lived protected. I'm embarrassed about it now. And I've had a lot of time now because I'm old to learn. But I just think, I don't even think you can even know, Skip and Peggy, how valuable this is for all of us. And even if we didn't grow up in this kind of little protected ivory world like I did, very working class, I just think this is something that we can hold in our hearts. I mean, hope you notice the women are wearing pearls today. This is in favor of and we're rocking this diverse woman who is vice president. I see Jody's got him on, Peggy's got him on, I've got him on, Jerry's got him on. This was not a mistake. Pajamas and pearls.
Love it.
Thank you, Jerry.
Could I say something else? I'm not from an urban community. I grew up in a rural community in central Pennsylvania. It too was generally a lily white community. We had one Black family in our community, and it was the Mills family, and they were relatives of the Mills brothers, the singing group. And the Mills brothers would come to Bellefonte after their tours of concerts and visit and spend time in our community. I didn't see any color. And that to me was the only family. But my eyes were opened when Martin Luther King came to Penn State University and spoke to the community with such passion and power. And that's when I started to notice the problems of the white supremacist situation. It won me over. So that's my story from white central Pennsylvania.
Beautiful. All very much appreciated, Dennis. Peggy, I think this would be a good point where we could take a minute to complete that Canton story, because what they want to share is very interesting. And then move into an assignment from you and where we're going, how we complete the rest.
So no one can get off yet. We haven't done assignments.
So let's hear the end tale very quickly on Frederick Douglass, and then we'll conclude the meeting with two important things: an assignment.
And we are going to stay on if people want to continue to discuss things, but we know some people might want to get off because of the election stuff.
Yeah.
Or inauguration.
Who's going to talk about Canton and Frederick?
Okay, since Harris Creek in Canton no longer exists, Safeway is on top of it. In doing the research on Harris Creek, what happened there, we found out that there was a bridge placed over it. But in studying it more, we found out that the Canton Company that orchestrated the Industrial Revolution in Canton from 1828 to 1980 had built a train depot for the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad at Kenwood and Boston Street. And we now think that this is the railroad that Frederick Douglass took to escape into the New York. And that was very important because if he had not, they didn't caught, he would have been a plantation slave there afterwards. He had an elaborate scheme that takes time to tell about, but he was scared stiff when he was on that colored car, and his heart was racing like a deer 150 times a minute because he was afraid until he got to New York that he was going to be discovered. Thereafter, he blossomed, but he would not have got there unless he escaped through Canton. And that's what we're writing out right now. We'll have history panels there within the next 2-3 months, and we're going to put together a Frederick Douglass symposium, an all-day symposium for African Americans on activism at the museum in Fells Point in February.
Thank you. And thank you so much for making sure we got that coda to the story, Ray. And Peggy, would you like to tell us our assignment and where we're going? You're muted.
Sorry.
Okay.
And we are going to take some time to share thoughts and emotions, because I know it's been a very emotional day. But first, I wanted to tell you what we have planned for the next couple of months in case you need to leave. So the Maryland legislature is now in session. So for next month, please research a House or a Senate bill that would help change a racist system or structure, and share it in February so that we can all contact our representatives. This is an extremely important action that you can take. Remember, we are meeting on the second Wednesday in February because of Ash Wednesday, so it'll be February 10th. And we'll continue to discuss reparations that have been made, failures, and more recent history during our lives. And in March, we have a guest speaker, Dr. Brown, who wrote The Black Butterfly. And those who saw the redlining exhibit at the Walters or watched the Beyond the Boundaries Zoom about redlining will remember that the butterfly shape on the Baltimore map shows where redlining and many other indicators of oppression took place, and hence the title of his book. His website, if you want to read his book ahead of time, is theblackbutterflyproject.com. So the website is theblackbutterflyproject.com. Also, please research Harriet Tubman for next month. So being an anti-racist takes effort, and we do thank you all for your commitment. We know it's not easy, but let's bow our heads for a final prayer, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
What a family.
Dear loving God, we ask that you grant all of us the wisdom and perseverance to stop racism and change the systems that support it. Please bless our president and vice president as they try to bring our country together. Amen.
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 I wanted to wear
Peggy?
pearls, but I couldn't get it around my neck.
I think you would
Peggy?
look cute. Yes, I don't know who said that. Who said Peggy?
I
Chuck.
couldn't find Rita's
Chuck.
pearls, so I'd wore
Pam made me take them off.
Peggy?
One
Yeah.
little thing to pass on
It's
to
Chuck.
Ray.
I think that's Father. I think Father has the floor. I can't find you. There you are. Yes.
Okay.
I'm lost again.
Sorry.
Move to the middle.
It was those sunglasses.
I will not speak to the veracity of what was told to me. I had a friend years ago who lived on South Dallas Street,
Mm-hmm.
and he was part of a group that wanted to have the city change the name from South Dallas to its original name, based on the fact that the church that Frederick Douglass attended was on that street. And I believe the foundation is still there. They wanted to change it to Strawberry Lane, and the city turned it down. So that's a story I've been told. I think it'd be interesting to find out if that is accurate or not, especially, Ray, if you're trying to put together a history around Frederick Douglass in Baltimore. So
Thank you.
if anybody can find out if that's an accurate description, that would be awesome.
Well, this will be a teaser for everyone. The Reginald F. Lewis Museum is built, as you know, on Pratt Street, which was from all the way up to where the stadium is down to the museum, was just loaded with slave auction stalls. I mean, you know, we know who the names were and everything. It was just loaded. But to the east side, there's a very small alley that the museum bricked in. It almost looks like it's just part of the museum's lot of land. That was called Slemmer's Alley. And we had a woman come who was an expert on Harriet Tubman, and she got out of the cab. She wasn't a Marylander. And when she started talking, she said, I am so excited. I had no idea this building was built right next to Slemmer's Alley. That's Slemmer's Alley out there. And we said, yeah, that's Slemmer's Alley. She said, no, you don't understand. Slemmer's Alley used to go straight through to the harbor. She said, it is in all likelihood, Harriet walked that alley several times coming into the city and moving into the city and about from the harbor. So our city is really just loaded with history.
And I've heard it, somebody mentioned to me, somebody from the street, that St. Vincent's was associated, or may have been associated with the Underground Railroad. And I had not heard that before. And again, I can't speak to the veracity of that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, I live in Federal Hill, and 1 block from Montgomery Street on the west side. And
Mhm.
I went to a book club when I lived in Federal Hill. And one of the women that lived on Montgomery Street said that they found in the basement of her house, the part of Montgomery Street that is still the original cobblestone that they're keeping refreshed. And she said they found that behind the wall, part of the Underground Railroad.
Wow.
And I'm just telling that to you now, and I still have goosebumps.
Wow.
And she said she would swear at night they would hear things. You know, she would just say that, but it's documented that the wall of that house covered up part of the Underground Railroad, and that was only like 1 block from where I lived when I lived in Federal Hill. And I was kind of like so proud of that part that the Underground Railroad went there. And you know, maybe Ray can find out something about those basements on Montgomery Street.
That is very cool.
There's some examples of the Underground Railroad in Old Town Ellicott City as well, tunnels and hiding places where where Harriet had kept slaves that they were heading towards the north and moving them. So that was I learned that one from working in Ellicott City and living there and being in the historic district.
Wow.
I know that Jerry has to leave because she has something early tomorrow. So Jerry, did you want to say something?
Well, I had a question for Skip. Yeah, Selwyn International didn't join us tonight, but they live in Morgan Park, and he grew up there.
Mm-hmm.
And I was curious that I thought I heard you say that Morgan Park was segregated, was restricted Blacks and Jewish people. But I always thought, and I should know this because they've given me some history of it, but I thought that was a place for Black professionals, that it was segregated, but it wasn't that Blacks were prohibited from living in Morgan Park.
No, I
the
didn't
other
mention Morgan Park. That wasn't me.
They
But
said
I know there
Roland.
was, yeah, the property beyond Morgan going over toward, oh shoot, the big highway that runs straight up.
Grand Parkway.
Yeah, you know, that was like a dividing line. And like there was a theater in Northwood that was segregated. So the students were protesting against that shopping center and that was right across the street from the campus. And then the theater that was a little farther up the street, I think closer to Loch Raven or something.
So I heard Lawrence Brown last night, the guy who wrote The Black Butterfly. I heard him on Monday. He was speaking to Mount Washington community, and we're going to have him talk in my community because the street I live on is a traditionally Black street in surrounded by a white neighborhood. And on those red line maps, it's indicated and so on. And so our neighborhood, Charles Village has, you know, we have Black and white areas and part of that history. So we're planning on having him come and talk with us specifically. But so he talked a lot about these covenant things. So the law as it read said that a white family could only sell to a white family, but also a black family could only sell to a black family. So what I had always heard was that Morgan Park was a restricted community, black only. Morgan Park was covered by a covenant that said it could only be, but too bad Jerry Sokola's gone. But anyway, I'll have to tell. So it was a covenanted community.
Restricted to blacks.
Right. And that's the way the law read.
Ah.
So if you were already on a black block couldn't sell to a white family, a white block couldn't sell to a black family, etc. was
That
how
would make sense.
it worked.
How it ran.
So, and yes, and Jews were a thing apart. So, Baltimore had this three-way segregation, and yeah, so that was part of it. So anyway, Lawrence Brown was great, and he does, he'll do research, like he could do something, if you ask him, he could talk specifically about the St. Vincent's neighborhood. At least he did that for Mount Washington. He has his presentation, but he also did some special research just for the community he was talking to. In Mount Washington, for example, Morgan wanted to move before they got the property that they got in Northeast Baltimore, which was funded by the Carnegies, I think. They wanted to move to Northwest Baltimore. They were trying to move to Mount Washington, and he read a letter from Sister Scholastica, the head of Mount St. Agnes. And I know some of people at St. Vincent's have Mount St. Agnes roots. And she was saying that they could not allow, she was writing to the mayor of Baltimore and saying, don't let Morgan move near us, because we have many daughters of the South coming to our college, and it would be very bad for, it was very embarrassing, to see this letter and think. So Mount St. Agnes took an active role in saying Morgan cannot come here, but so did, he was pointing out, and they are asking about reparations. So what can Mount Washington do? Given their own history of racial segregation, what can so they're thinking about that, and our neighborhood's going to be thinking about it too, our own legacy and how we could make some reparations.
And Dr. Brown said he is very flexible. So next month we will ask you of any questions you'd like us to pose to him ahead of time that you'd like him to cover. So feel free to think about that, what you would like him to discuss. He said he could talk about Baltimore apartheid. He could talk about, whatever we want him to. So
I think there's another dimension to this. It would be, it's hard to flesh out, but while we're talking about these strictures that created repression and segregation, we often don't get the story of the Black people who fought back and of the strong efforts that were made in the community. It's not just an oppressed community that was crushed. There were leaders, Douglas is the example that we started with tonight, who left Baltimore, but there were people of Baltimore who stayed. Baltimore had the largest population of freed Blacks before the Civil War of any city in the country. We just tonight just said something about the highway, and we said, oh, it made it's Art Cohen and Paul Sarbanes and Barbara Mikulski, but there were Black leaders who fought the Expressway in West Baltimore, like Esther Reed and Helena Hicks and Norman Reeves and Iris Reeves, and in Southwest Baltimore, Mildred Moon and Sharp Leadenhall. And we're not raising, we need to raise up their stories as part of the whole story here. Is not just, oh, the poor Black community got crushed under, and it was as if it had no resilience and strength, and it didn't take a lot to crush it.
good point, Joe. Hey, look at Elijah Cummings.
Skip probably knows this, but I listened to Professor Glaude from Princeton, who teaches, I think, something like Black Studies, and he just recently did a biography about the Black community, and he's gave the Martin Luther King lecture on Saturday. It was excellent. But the reason I'm mentioning it because it was sponsored by not only the library, but the Lewis Museum. And you can still hear it on YouTube if you go on the website of the Pratt Library.
No, I didn't know it. Thanks a lot for sharing that.
Thanks, Chuck. Jim, did you have something?
No, nothing to add. I could put my 2 cents in about Northwood and the covenant that we inherited when we bought a house there. And obviously Evelyn's got a lot of stories. I can tell you that I have never seen her as outraged as she was on January 6th. That her idea was that there is no way if there were Black people did that they would survive. They would be shot, they would be arrested, they would have been carried off. And she was furious.
Better believe it. Absolutely true.
Yep.
There would have been bodies all over there.
Yep. They would have been dead inside the Capitol. They wouldn't have been unarrested outside.
Jerry, I'm going to have to sign off after this, but I wanted to share with you, I grew up just south of North Avenue on Madison Avenue. It was because my uncle, who was involved in the Black Numbers, had a townhouse there, Askew Gatewood. He was a close friend of Little Willie's. He and Little Willie came up from the South together. So the interesting thing about my growing up was Madison Avenue from North Avenue down was Black into downtown, and McCullough Street. McCullough Street was the dividing line for a while, but then the block busting took it over to Fulton Avenue. The east side of Fulton was Black and the west side was white. And there was a huge battle about Blacks crossing Fulton Avenue because then that opened up the whole Walbrook area. Right on the east of us was Utah Place. Utah Place had been a very wealthy street because it had the big center strip, and it's where wealthy white people would come from downtown Baltimore on horseback straight on up into Druid Hill Park. But after that, it was basically a white neighborhood. So that was a dividing line on one side of us and on the other side of us. So we were just sort of sandwiched in. And the other thing I remember was directly behind us, that all the Utah houses had garages. At one point, a number of Appalachian white people moved in, I guess seeking, better prospects economically in Baltimore. They could only afford the garages. And so they would live, I'd come out of my house, that we had an apartment in that my uncle owned, and look out my backyard across the alley to the garages. And I would see people putting like a carpet down on the concrete in the garage, and a bed and hot plates and whatnot. If the garage had electricity, there was no plumbing. So they were putting their human waste deposit in the trash. The trash collectors were complaining about it. But we were not allowed to play as children with the white kids right literally across the alley. And my first real memory of racism was the custom on our block was your mother called you in at the heat of the summer day. You had to get a bath, maybe take a nap. Then you put on evening clothes because you was stinky, from all the morning play. And one evening, I think we were old enough to walk around onto North Avenue and go to the Arundel's ice cream store to get an ice cream cone. So my 2 or 3 friends and I walked around there. Just ahead of us were some kids from the alley behind Utah Place. They bought ice cream cones and they went through this little swinging gate to sit down at the booths and eat. I had never even noticed that before because we'd only ever just bought ice cream and left. I didn't know why, but it was the first time I noticed the gate. So we bought the ice cream and I said to my friends, come on. And we started through the gate. This big hefty woman with the Arundel apron that they used to wear on their uniform blocked the gate from swinging open. And she had her hands crossed like this. And she said, where do you think you're going? And I said, in there to eat our ice cream cones. I can't remember exactly what she said, but she made it quite clear we weren't going through that gate. And the reason didn't have, and I thought she thought that we hadn't gotten cleaned up for the evening. And I said, oh, we've had our baths, you know. But what she said after that made it clear it had nothing to do with what we were wearing. It had to do with us. And I remember going home and I was crying as I walked home, and the other guys went into their parents, and Mom was there, and I started crying and I told her what happened. And my father just got off the streetcar at the corner, and he was coming home from work at Hustler's, and she said, Jack, he knows. And they had just opened up the Met Theater at North in Pennsylvania so that Blacks could go there. And I remember that night they gave me a great dinner and we went to see a movie at the Met and all of that. But none of that could take away the feeling I had inside. That was when I sort of vowed whatever people thought that we couldn't do, I was going to do, and I was going to do better than them. But it sort of became the driving motive for my education and everything after that. But I will never forget that incident. And it all had to do with all the segregated, strict lines that you never cross, not even a block away.
No, this is E.E. Cummings. And E.E. Cummings said, one day, my heart and head filled with glee, I was walking in old Baltimore and saw a boy and smiled at he. He looked at me and said, nigger. And I cried. E.E. Cummings, that's a paraphrase of it. Look it up. One day walking in old Baltimore. And I read that when I first started teaching in Anne Arundel County, and it like broke my heart because a lot of my kids were African Americans.
Yeah.
And I was teaching English at the time.
There's a Black poet, and I should know his name, but I'm at this age where I'm forgetting it. And he's a famous Black poet, but he's the same thing while walking once in Baltimore. And he goes to that line, he says, now I was only X years old, and he was no whit bigger, but he.
That's E.E. Cummings. That's it.
Yeah, nigger. And then he says, I saw the whole of Baltimore from May until December. Of all the things that happened there, that's all that I remember.
That's all that I remember. That's it. That's it. It just, that's why I said I paraphrase it. That was he. And when I found it, I mean, I used to make my classes in graduate school read that. I mean, and you just made me think of it. I forgot all about it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Skip.
Thank you all. I love my church family, and I'm getting the call from Pam. My broccoli and sweet potato are cold.
Oh,
Thank you, Skip.
We love you, Skip.
We love you. I love you all so much. I'll be honest, I would not be an organized religion church attender if it weren't for St. Vincent's. You all helped me keep my faith.
Neither would a lot of other of us.
Thanks, everybody.
We'll talk soon, Skip.
Thank you, Peggy. Love you.
Terry, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I have a story like Skip's from the other side. When I was a young kid living in the Bronx, there was a pool, a swimming pool, and I wanted to go to the swimming pool one day. My mother said, no, you can't go to that pool. And I said, why not? She said, because that's where the Black people swim. And you can't swim with the Black people. So it's from the other side, it was the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
White people don't mix with Black people, especially in a pool. And I felt really bad about it, and I couldn't understand why that was. And I was probably 10.
I can't understand a lot of things. Ray?
Well, some of these stories remind me of some things as well. But two things that have hurt me a lot during the years, and two statements. One, that Black people each morning have to remind themselves that they're Black. It's going to be a different day and the like. And I recall one when I first became a physician, and I was discharging my first patient to the office, and I said, come in, the medicine you take, and that, and she said, "Dr. Barr, do you take Black people in your office?" And that really hit me because she, to her, that was way she was getting along with life. She was numbed about her prior experiences, and it was acceptable to her to be like that. She just wanted to know going forward whether she could come to the office, and that hurt me more than her. The fact that she knew that she was Black and she had to be treated differently. And the other is, Black people are not afforded the luxury of taking a break from fighting for justice every day. And that's what Frederick Douglass was all about. Struggle, agitate, agitate, agitate. You'll never become a 10, but you get close to it. And that's what white supremacy is all about. And that's what we have to fight. And that book, White Too Long, is an eye-opener as to what we need to do, because we don't have a force against the problems that we are seeing. And a force could come from a church that reaches all the churches and develops social justice minded people that advocates and has somewhat of a force going forward. We lack that force, and we need to find a way that we reach out to all our Christian people and go up against whiteism. Just a thought.
We sure learned how many white priests and bishops and cardinals still don't have a clue. Last election. Anybody else want to throw anything in there? I'll tell you, I thought it was so wonderful today, this morning, the poem and the speeches. Love and light kept coming up, and I kept thinking Martin Luther King. That's what he was all about, love and light. And it was a powerful day. I'm sure everybody felt the same. All right, well, God bless you all. You're wonderful. And we know we have so much work to do, but we'll keep on. And Jerry, don't feel bad. That's what we said, like one of the first meetings. I was so ignorant about everything. So you weren't alone, believe me. White, growing up lily white neighborhoods. All right, thank you all. Stay safe. Have a good evening.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Stop your recording.
Thank you.